Somewhere between Scotland and Norway, there's a group of islands where the DNA doesn't match the passport. The people there are legally British. Culturally, they're Orcadian. But genetically, they're more Norse than most Norwegians. That's not a metaphor. It's a finding from peer-reviewed genetic research. 60% of male lineages in Orkney trace directly to Scandinavian ancestors. In some of Norway's own coastal regions, that number is lower. To understand how that happened, you have to go back over 1,200 years. And you have to understand that the Vikings who hit Orkney didn't come to raid and leave. They came to stay. Long before any Norse longship appeared on the horizon, Orkney was already remarkable. The Neolithic people who settled these islands around 3,500 BCE didn't build simple villages. They raised stone monuments that still stand today. Skara Brae, a stone village so well preserved that archaeologists routinely compare it to Pompeii, its walls and furnishings intact after 5,000 years under the peat. The Ring of Brodgar, a ceremonial stone circle still commanding the landscape between two locks. The Ness of Brodgar, a massive ceremonial complex only partially excavated, which archaeologists believe may have been one of the most significant ritual sites in all of prehistoric Britain. These weren't isolated islanders scraping out survival on the edge of the world. These islands were a cultural and ceremonial hub, not a fringe outpost. Orkney was, in the Neolithic era, arguably more connected to the wider prehistoric network of Northern Europe than many parts of what we now call mainland Britain. Trade goods, architectural ideas, and ritual practices moved across these northern waters with a regularity that modern observers find surprising. These were not people cut off from the world, they were participants in it. That civilization declined, as they all do. Bronze Age settlers followed, bringing metal tools, new burial traditions, and a gradually shifting relationship with the land. Iron Age communities took root after them, building brocks, the tall, circular dry stone towers unique to northern Scotland that still dot the Orcadian landscape, their walls thick enough to have survived 2,000 years of Atlantic weather. Then Pictish culture, which left carved symbol stones and warrior burials across the north of Scotland, including in Orkney. The Picts were not a peripheral people. They were organized, artistically sophisticated, and fierce enough to resist Roman expansion into the far north. Roman commanders wrote about them with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. In Orkney, their presence is documented in burial sites, symbol stones, and settlement patterns that were, by the 8th century CE, the dominant indigenous layer of the island's population. For centuries, the islands absorbed new peoples, new cultures, new genes, but no single arrival was dominant enough to fundamentally overwrite what was already there. Until the Norse. The first Norse settlers likely arrived in Orkney in the late 8th century, around the time of the famous Lindisfarne raid that marks the opening of the Viking Age in the historical record. But the parallel is misleading. Unlike raids, which were temporary, strike, plunder, withdraw, the settlement of Orkney was permanent and, by historical and genetic standards, overwhelming. These were not warriors passing through. They were farmers, fishermen, and families looking for land. And Orkney, with its fertile coastal plains, sheltered bays, and familiar cold climate environment, looked a great deal like the western Norwegian coastline they had left behind. The crossing from western Norway to Orkney is roughly 300 miles, manageable in a Norse longship with favorable winds. For communities already accustomed to open water navigation, it wasn't a leap into the unknown. It was a calculated move toward better land. Norse settlers came in large numbers relative to the existing population. They brought wives, children, livestock, and farming traditions adapted to cold coastal environments nearly identical to those of western Norway, particularly the regions around Hordaland and Rogaland, which isotopic and genetic analysis of Viking-era burials has identified as likely origin points for many early Orcadian Norse settlers. Over decades, they established homesteads, displaced or absorbed the Pictish and earlier Celtic populations, and began speaking Old Norse as the dominant language of daily life, trade, and law. The transition was not instantaneous. It was generational, a slow, uneven process of displacement and absorption that left fewer and fewer spaces where the old ways survived. Within roughly 2 centuries, Orkney had been transformed beyond recognition. The Old Norse dialect, Norn, became the primary language of the archipelago, spoken not just by settlers, but by their descendants born on these islands, who knew no other tongue. Norse law governed land ownership, inheritance, and dispute resolution. The old Pictish culture had almost entirely disappeared, not just culturally, but biologically. The symbol stones stopped being carved. The old burial traditions vanished. The language left no descendants. What had taken thousands of years to build was effectively overwritten in the span of a few generations. It is one of the most complete cultural and genetic replacements documented anywhere in the prehistoric and early medieval British Isles. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA from Viking-era burial sites in Orkney, combined with modern population studies, has now confirmed the full scale of this transformation. The male line Norse signal, tracked through the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, is approximately 60% in today's population. That figure alone places Orkney in a category of its own among populations outside Scandinavia. For comparison, most regions of England that experienced substantial Viking settlement, such as Yorkshire, East Anglia, and the old Danelaw heartlands, show Norse male line signals of around 20 to 30%. Significant by any measure, but nowhere near what Orkney carries. Even within Scandinavia, regional variation means some coastal Norwegian communities today show lower Norse paternal signals than a group of islands sitting off the northern tip of Scotland. Mitochondrial data, the female line passed from mother to child, is more mixed, sitting at around 35 to 40% Norse. That gap between the male and female signals is not an anomaly, it is a clue. It suggests that early Norse settlers were disproportionately male, arriving without enough Norse women to sustain a fully endogamous community. They took local wives, Pictish women, women from earlier Celtic descended populations, and built households that were Norse in name, language, law, and paternal genetics, but carried the older genetic threads of the islands through the maternal line. Over time, that produced a population that was culturally and predominantly genetically Norse, with threads of older ancestry woven in through the female line. The Picts were not entirely erased. They survived, quietly, in the mitochondria of a people who no longer remembered them. It is a deeply human detail, the conquered persisting invisibly inside the conqueror's own children. The Earldom of Orkney became one of the most powerful Norse political entities in the entire North Atlantic. Orcadian jarls commanded fleets, controlled critical sea lanes between Scotland, Ireland, and Norway, collected tribute from subordinate territories, and fought in the wars of Norwegian kings as significant military allies. Sagas, like the Orkneyinga saga, a remarkable historical chronicle composed in Iceland in the 13th century, recorded their dynasties in detail that rivals anything written about comparable European aristocracies of the period. Thorfinn the Mighty, arguably the greatest of the Orcadian earls, ruled in the 11th century over a domain that stretched from Orkney deep into mainland Scotland and across to parts of Ireland. He was, by the standards of his time, a major European power. Orkney was not peripheral to the Norse world. It was one of its operational centers, a staging post, a power base, and a home. Ships provisioned here, armies assembled here. Dynasties were born and buried here. In 1468, the political story shifted. Orkney was pledged to Scotland by the Danish-Norwegian crown as part of a royal dowry arrangement for the marriage of Margaret of Denmark to the future James III of Scotland. The dowry was never paid. The islands were formally annexed by Scotland in 1472 and never returned to Norwegian rule. Politically, Orkney became Scottish. the Norse Earldom ended. Norse law was replaced by Scots law. The Norn language began a slow decline, eventually dying out entirely by the 18th century, replaced by a Scots dialect that today carries faint Norse echoes in vocabulary and place names but is unmistakably Northern British in character. On paper, the Norse chapter was closed, but political borders and genetic ones don't move in sync. 6 centuries of Scottish rule, more than half a millennium of integration with the mainland, of intermarriage with Scottish and British populations, of cultural absorption into the broader British sphere haven't erased the Norse signal. If anything, the island's relative isolation has preserved it. Islands are genetic conservatories. The sea creates a barrier that slows the genetic mixing that occurs naturally and rapidly in connected continental populations. Orkney's communities, separated by water and historically sustained by local marriage networks, kept the Norse lineage concentrated at levels that had no equivalent on the mainland. The genes that arrived with those Western Norwegian settlers over 1,200 years ago are still measurably, dominantly present, because there was simply nowhere for them to go. No great city nearby, pulling in migrants from across the country. No major trade route dissolving the local population into a continental average. Just sea, stone, and the same families, generation after generation. Modern Orcadians who take ancestry tests are often confronted with results that list Scandinavian ancestry as their largest single component. Larger than Scottish, larger than British, larger than anything else the test can identify. Their family names are Scottish. Their accents are Northern British. Many have no conscious connection to Norse history or Viking culture, no particular interest in longships or sagas, no family story that reaches back to Norway. But their DNA is telling a different story, one written in longship timber and Norse law, still audible in the place names scattered across the archipelago, still measurable in the cells of people who may never have thought of themselves as anything other than British. The past doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits quietly in the genome, waiting to be read. Kirkwall comes from Kirkjuvager, Norse for Church Bay, Stromness, Bersai, Hoy, Evie, Rendell, Orfir, Stennes. The landscape is still, 12 centuries later, named in the language of the people who arrived and never truly left. Every time someone gives directions in Orkney, every time a postcode is written or a ferry route named, the Norse settlement speaks again, not as history, but as habit. The longships rotted, the earls died. The sagas were written down centuries after the events they described. The Norn language fell silent. The earldom dissolved into Scottish administration, and still the 60% held. It is still here, in the blood of farmers and fishermen, teachers and shopkeepers, Orcadians who carry inside them a direct measurable line to the men who crossed the North Sea and decided simply to stay. Not to raid, not to conquer and move on, to stay. And in staying, to become, more completely than perhaps anywhere else on Earth, the genetic definition of what it means to be Viking.